Kant said that Hume demonstrated irrefutably that it was impossible for reason to think a priori without experience by means of concepts, a combination involving necessity. We cannot at all see why, in consequence of the existence of one thing, another must necessarily exist, or how these concepts of such a combination can arise prior to experience. Hence, Hume inferred that reason was altogether deluded with reference to this concept, which she erroneously considered as one of her children, whereas in reality it was nothing but a bastard of imagination, impregnated by experience, which subsumed certain representations under the law of association, and mistook the subjective necessity of habit for an objective necessity arising from insight. This is Hume's critique of causation. So Kant concludes instead that there can be no doubt that all of our knowledge begins with experience, but though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience. Now, what does all of that mean? Well, it means that Hume was correct. We cannot, through reason alone, say that just because one thing has happened, the cause, that means that the next thing, the effect, necessarily must happen. Just because we've experienced flipping a light switch means the lights turn on and off does not mean that rationally the lights must turn on or off just because we flip a switch. There are other logical possibilities. Thus, we are thoroughly deluded that we think that causation is proven rationally and that we've been able to figure out the universe. It's a bastard of imagination, this idea of causation. It's illegitimate. It is impregnated by experience in that habit, as Hume says, has given us this idea of cause and effect, and we subsume it under these laws of association, as Hume says, but it is simply, again as Hume says, habit and an objective necessity because we have to live that way. Therefore, Kant concludes that though the empiricists are correct that all of our knowledge begins with experience, there must be something else that allows us to make sense of our sense impressions, something that structures it, and thus knowledge does not all arise out of experience. Now, this is a difficult thing for us to really grasp, to really comprehend, and the way to do that is what Kant calls the transcendental method. As in, we look at all of our experiences in general and try to think about what it is that is the same in all of our experiences. What structures, what categories of experience are always there, no matter where we look or what we are experiencing or what we're even thinking about. And what Kant found is that there are two fundamentals of perception and of human thought that are always there. And those two, which is the beginning of his whole schema, are space and time. Yes, space and time. We know space and time now so much in terms of Einstein and his theories, but of course Kant is well before Einstein. So let's think of it simply in terms of space as in the thing that contains objects, and time, this thing that no philosopher has yet been able to figure out, but which we obviously experience even though we have no idea what it is. Space and time are part of every single perception that we have. So, okay, look at this. This is a field of blue. You may think, oh, I can think of blue. Just blue, the concept itself. And no, you can't think of it except in terms of space and time. That's why I've got this blue box up here. See, you are seeing a field of blue. It takes up space. You cannot imagine blue in itself. You can only imagine a blue something. And you cannot even think about it except in terms of time, because as you think about things, you are thinking through the passage of time and the thought that you had just a second ago and the thought that you might have in this next second, and just on and on and on. All of our experiences are structured by time. That word that I said a few seconds ago, and now this word now, and now again. The now is always happening one now to the next, and it's always happening in a space relation. It's happening here, it's happening there. This blue exists in space, this blue exists in time, and you cannot imagine otherwise unless you are an incredibly adept spiritual monk somewhere. Kant says that space and time are what fundamentally structure our sense impressions, which are presented to us in our mental intuition about the world around us. But now we have to turn to how we think about things. Obviously, we think about things in terms of space and time, but there's also a lot more of what needs to go on in order for us to have full-blown knowledge. There needs to be a further set of organizing principles. So there is the faculty of intuition, the sense impressions that are structured in terms of space and time, and then there is what Kant calls the faculties of understanding, which has the categories of understanding by which our experiences are categorized, schematized, and made sense. So from space and time, we have categories which he puts into 4 broad types: quantity, quality, relation, and modality. We won't go through them all because that would take a lot of time, but let's go through quantity to kind of get a sense of what Kant is really getting at here. When we talk about quantity of things, we first need to have the idea, the concept of unity, or one. Now, think about this for a second. How could we possibly think of anything, or anything in terms of anything, if we do not have the ability within our mind to think of one? Well, we couldn't go anywhere. So unity or oneness, we have the ability to think of there is a something in front of me. Plurality, then, is the idea of more than one. Okay, so I have one thing, and I have now 2 things, and maybe 3 things, and 4 things, and a whole lot of things. Again, to move from one and then the ability to have more than one, that's a big deal. Now, then we have the idea of totality. In other words, the sense I'm considering these things as a total quantity of things. So when we look at objects in the world, we think in terms of, well, that's one object, and here's another object, and these 2 objects together are more than one object, and I want to consider these objects and not these other objects in my considerations of things. Now, this graphic here is showing us an extension of Hume's billiard ball example, which I talked about in a previous lecture. How is Kant able to think about this whole quandary that Hume gives us about the billiard balls? How do I know that if I hit the white ball and have it strike the red ball will actually move? Well, I can think about this in terms of, well, unity, plurality, the reality of the sense impressions that are given to me, and the sense of causality. Causality is a relation. This notion that we have that things do interact, actually interact, and one thing can cause another thing to happen. What is important to grasp here is that what's going on inside our mind is that we think in terms of these categories. They aren't given to us by experience. We don't learn them. They are just the way we think. Kant famously said that maybe God and horseflies could think differently, but we humans think in these terms. We think in terms of reality, yes, negation, no, limitation, that's all. We think in terms of possibility. We think in terms of this exists, that this necessarily must exist, and on and on and on. And so everything is structured in space, everything is structured in time, and everything is structured in terms of these other 12 categories of understanding. There is no human thought apart from these. Now, this, in Kant's mind, and he's got a point, answers Hume's skepticism. We can make judgments about the world because we have the ability to categorize, schematize, make sense of our sense impressions. And that then leads us to an ability to think about our experiences.
So what all of this system that Kant has created leaves us with is a way of thinking about how human beings perceive the world and understand the world, or perhaps more appropriately, understand their perceptions of the world. Hume had said that the human self and human experience is nothing but this humble jumble of sense impressions. Well, Kant says that what we are left with is, yes, our reality, our understanding begins with this series of sense impressions, but that the human mind has the capability of imposing some sort of structure and sense upon those experiences. For example, let's take a piece of music. What you are really experiencing in music is simply a series of sounds, of vibrations. Now we call them notes, but they're not even notes. They're just simply vibrations. That's the material reality of music. But because we have this capacity that Kant labels the synthesis of apprehension and intuition, a very fancy thing for we can just understand how to take things out of our experience and put them in, take them from the intuition, the essential experiencing of things. And we can make them make sense. To experience music is to experience these vibrations as notes, and as notes that can be connected. And therefore we can think of a song as coming out of this series of vibrations, these sounds that we are hearing. And this is also why the human mind can hear music, not just in things that human beings deliberately are intending to be understood as music, but music in the rain, in the wind, in just things happening around us. We can understand them, perceive them as having a musical quality, because that is how our mind works. The ability to see faces in objects, that's again something the mind can put that filter on things, because that's what the mind does. It synthesizes the impressions that are within our intuition, and we can apprehend or comprehend them in other ways. And that is part of what can make us imagine things and be creative about things, because of our ability to be able to put structure on just otherwise disparate sense impressions. And rather than just simply being a mere perceiver of things, we can actually hold these things in memory. Philosophy really has not done, even still to this day, a really good job of a philosophy of memory and what it really means for us. Augustine, way back in the 4th, 5th century, was the only philosopher to really talk deeply about memory, but that's a whole other lecture. Kant did talk about what he called the synthesis of reproduction in imagination. Imagination here just simply being our ability, a mental ability, to form images in our minds based upon our past experiences. So when we hear a melody, we can remember it, which is a very good thing, because if we didn't have the ability to remember and call into our mental faculties the memories that we have had, then we couldn't even appreciate a melody, a song, as a melody and song. Because think about it, if you have 4 notes, dun 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 dum, dum doesn't mean anything except in the context of the 4 notes. And if you couldn't remember the first 3 notes, then you're never going to be able to pick out a melody out of that. Simple, right? And yet someone has to catalog all of this, and that's what Kant is doing here. And then finally he talks about the synthesis of recognition in a concept, that we can then think about these things. This is the gift from rationalism that we can add to the empiricism. We can reason about these things that are within our mind. We can be creative with them. We can bring up the reproduction and imagination, and we can think about it. It's like, well, that melody, how does that make me feel? How does that melody compare to other melodies? What is the similarities between Beethoven and the Beatles. How has music changed over the years? Just all kinds of things. We can take things, we can rearrange things. And the reason why we can do this is because of the structures of our mind, the ability to impose the mental abilities that we have to take the products that are given to our understanding by the categories of understanding and then play with them. Remember them, move them around, and of course, always understand them. But there are key and very important limitations to our understanding, and this is where Kant is not a rationalist, because he doesn't just think that that means that we have absolute truth, our ability that we can think about things. So many people still to this day think, well, I think that this piece of music is blah, 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 and therefore this piece of music is blah, blah, blah. Not true. Music, of course, is not really the perfect analogy for this, but objects are. Behold, a box. And you can say, as any empiricists would, like Locke, well, the box has particular qualities to it. It's kind of rectangular or flat, it's white, it has no other features to it, and so it looks like a box. Those qualities together make it seem like to us that it is a box. What Kant is saying is that those are the phenomena that are presented to the mind, the whiteness, the flatness, the rectangularness, etc. But that's not the box. Here's where the gift of empiricism also helps us to understand the world, because Hume is correct. All we have about the box is the phenomena, not what Kant calls the noumena. What's inside the box? What's behind the box? What is the box? We don't know. And worse, we can't know. Because we, in our human minds, our limited human minds, cannot penetrate the noumena of any object, or the noumena of any phenomena at all. It's just phenomena. Sound? Yes. Maybe indicates that there's something in the box. But we don't know, because we can't open the box. It's a metaphor. The limits of human reason, the limits of human understanding. We are tiny creatures in a big universe. Our understanding is limited. Our reason is limited. Now, it's not hopeless. Even though we're limited to phenomena, not noumena, there are, Kant says, certain things that we can take for granted. One of which, of course, is that there's a self. Hume had said that we never perceive a self. So Kant, because Kant is willing to make this Copernican revolution of our mind contributes to our experience, as we've seen with the categories of understanding, can also bring forward the idea that, well, gosh darn, we can't perceive a self. However, we can rationally and with justification assume there is a self. There's a me here. Hi. And that hi is to myself as much as anything else, because I can perceive that there has to be a self within the experiences that I have. Right now, you are listening to sounds, you are seeing images, and that you there is assumed. And it's assumed because it's the only thing that makes anything make sense. And that's what Hume missed that Kant realized. Yes, we have nothing but phenomena. We have nothing but sense impressions. But our mind collects these impressions, orders these impressions, structures these impressions, and gives it to us. Although, don't take that analogy too far, like if somehow this is a machine and spits out something and our minds perceive it. That is what the us is, this perceiving being. Descartes was slightly correct on this, that Descartes was saying that, I am a thinking thing. It's not simply, I exist. No, I exist as a thinking thing. that is the essence of my existence. And Kant takes that to a point, but Kant would disagree with Descartes in assuming that the self is a substance. The self is a concept, but it's a necessary concept, because if we have no concept that I am this discrete entity that is having all of these experiences as an entirety through my life, as Locke had talked about, what defines a person? That person is defined by the continuity of their memories of their experiences. Kant says, yes, that makes sense. And we have to assume that. The I cannot see itself. Think about that for a second. All these things that you see in the universe around you, but you never see an eye, you never see your own eye, and don't be smart and go, I can look into a mirror. Of course you can look into a mirror. What are you seeing? You're seeing a reflection of something. Are you still seeing your eye? No, you're seeing a reflection, which may or may not be your eye. You never see your own eyes. You never see your own self. But of course, because you have vision, there must be an I that's having the vision. Because you are having experiences, there must be a self having the experiences. QED. And without that, we're dead in the water. We just cannot. But that simple observation allowed the creation of what we now know as psychology. That's a whole other story, but take that in, that everything that psychology is to this day, both good and bad, is because Kant made this breakthrough in understanding of things. Now, there's two other things that Kant says that are things that we have to rationally assume are true, even though without proof. One of which is the cosmos, which is the universe, the everything. We talk about universe now, we tend to not use the Greek word cosmos anymore, but cosmos is existence, reality itself, everything. We are this tiny being in this gigantic universe. We have to assume that there's a cosmos. We have to assume that. It's the flip side of the whole self thing. If I'm having all these experiences, well, I have to assume that I'm a self having these experiences, and I also have to assume that there is something that I am experiencing. The opposite of that assumption is solipsism. Solipsism is the idea that the only thing that exists is me. And if the only thing that exists is me, then I'm not having an experience of anything. It's all just in my own mind. And that's a very lonely place to be. But even Descartes wasn't a solipsist. He was accused of it, but he wasn't. He believed that he was having these experiences, even in the depths of the deepest doubt. Kant simply says, look, if you're a being who's having experiences, then two things must necessarily be true. You are a self who is having these experiences, and there is a world, a cosmos, that you are experiencing. Now, the third one, which some people will have problems with, is God. Kant assumes that there is a God. Again, this is the God of the philosophers. It is not the God of faith. Even in Kant, and I know that he talks a little bit about, we must put aside knowledge and make room for faith, but he means that in the classical sense of we have to believe that there is a tradition of knowledge and body there, and of course he believes that there has to be a God simply because, well, there has to be a beginning. There has to be a beginning to all of this. It didn't just always exist and never changing and this and that. And it's a very Western conception, a very Western assumption that Kant is having here because, well, that's what all Westerners have. There has to be a beginning. Even today with this Big Bang Theory thing that scientists now assume is dogma, but we don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But so there has to be a beginning. So there has to be an end. The Buddhists and Hindus and Jains are going, no, that's your assumption, not ours. But Kant is a Westerner, so he assumes there must be a beginning. Aristotle, the first unmoved mover, and so Kant says, well, there's got to be that. Now, that's kind of where it begins and ends for Kant. Now, Kant is, in his moral philosophy, which is better discussed elsewhere, is assuming that faith in God is a very big and important thing, and God is the moral rule maker, all of that stuff. But in terms of philosophy, of epistemology, of physics, of all of that stuff, God really isn't an issue. It's just there has to be a beginning. but both empirically and rationally, but especially rationally, God is not part of the equation. And therefore Kant said about God, there are no proofs that God exists. There are no disproofs that God exists in terms of rational argument. And what's more, just like Kant says we cannot prove that there is a self, we cannot prove there is a universe, we cannot prove any of this stuff, we cannot prove that there is a God, so don't even try. It's a waste of time. Which is why even when I teach philosophy of religion courses, I don't spend more than a minute talking about the so-called rational proofs of the existence of God. Because Kant showed us over 200 years ago, it's completely meaningless. Whether you believe in God or not is a question entirely outside of rational contemplation. If God is experienced, then God is experienced. You can believe in God if you experience God. If you don't experience God, well, you're SOL, I guess. But the point is here, again, our rational logic, thinking about the world, it can't prove God, it can't prove self, it can't prove the world, it can't prove our science, it can't prove anything. Pure reason is very limited. It's this tiny little thing that we can use to kind of play like we would play with little balls inside our little minds. It doesn't tell us anything about the world. Experience tells us about the world, and our mind structures those experiences. And if that sounds a little weird, well, it's only because it's so taken for granted now that that's how we are about things, even though we forget this all the time. The reality is that we live in a Kantian world, a Kantian universe, in that we understand that our minds contribute to experience, but only to a point. Our minds remain quite limited, and our experience remains quite limited. And it's this opening of the door. I talk about that a lot. When someone opens a door, people walk through the door. And the whole rest of the post-Kantian era of philosophy is people walking through that door that Kant opened. And some people really kicked in that door almost violently. But that's another lecture.